What's up, everyone? Another episode of Culture Check, and just so we're clear, this one's going to be a little bit longer than the normal ones. I feel like it's important that we talk about, especially with things that's going on. So today on the Culture Check, we're going to talk about something that should alarm every American who cares about constitutional freedom. If you haven't heard, it's about the federal arrest of the veteran journalist Don Lemon. Not for a crime, but for doing journalism at a protest. So I'm going to ask y'all this. What does this say about where our country is heading? Are foundational freedoms being recalibrated or eroded? Now, if you are unaware of what has happened, on January 29th, former CNN anchor Don Lemon, who is also now an independent journalist, was arrested by federal agents in LA in connection with his reporting on a protest in City's Church in St. Paul, Minnesota. Now, authorities say the protest disrupted a service and alleged Lemon violated federal law related to obstruction and civil rights. Now, let me remind you, Lemon live-streamed the event and incites he was acting as a journalist, doing nothing more than covering the protest. He pled not guilty, but he has been released. Now, press freedom groups, civil liberties advocates, and public figures have condemned the arrest as a dangerous threat to the First Amendment protection. This is not just a fringe claim, y'all. Major news outlets and rights organizations are now raising red flags. Now you might ask me, why does this matter? So when you took U.S. history, the U.S. Constitution is talked about. And the U.S. Constitution guarantees freedom of the press. That's the right for journalists to report news and for citizens to receive information, especially about protests and government actions. Many critics argue that this arrest and how it was pursued even after a judge declined the approval of the initial charge sends a chilling message to journalists. That's not just about one reporter, y'all. It's about who gets to report, how they get to report, and under what threat. Here's a question for y'all. At what point does enforcing a law cross into suppressing dissent? So to understand why this moment matters, we have to talk about the charges. Not the headlines, not the outrage, but the legal mechanics that made this arrest possible. So, a common misconception is that journalists cannot be arrested. Let me just let you know that's not legally true. Yes, journalists are protected by the First Amendment, but they are not immune from arrest if law enforcement claims a law was violated. The issue is not whether an arrest is technically possible, it's how the law is implied and whether it's being stretched. In cases like this, authorities don't usually charge someone for journalism. They rely on secondary or adjacent offenses such as obstruction or interference with law enforcement, unlawful assembly or remaining at a scene after an order to disperse, or conspiracy, which is broadly defined as coordination with others at a protest, or it could be disorderly conduct or disruption of a protected space. Now, these charges are intentionally broad, which gives law enforcement discretion. And that discretion is where the controversy begins. Now, broad statutes exist for legitimate reasons, but history shows that they are often used to either create a probable cause where intent is ambiguous. It could be to collapse the distinction between observers and participants. It could justify arrest even when charges may later be dropped. This is how someone can be arrested without the government having to prove guilt first. An arrest is a process, not a conviction, but the impact happens immediately. To arrest someone, officers only need to have probable cause, which is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and they have to have a belief that a law may have been violated. Now, as you all may know, if you have common sense, I would say that a low legal bar, that really is, and it's intentional for it, because when applied to journalists covering protests, it becomes controversial. Because now the question becomes, was the person arrested for breaking the law or for being present while power felt challenged? Now, I may ask y'all, do y'all see a pattern versus an isolated event? Some civil liberties advocates argue this isn't an isolated event with Don Lemon, pointing to other recent clashes between journalists and federal agencies. They frame it as part of a pattern where journalists covering immigration, enforcement, protest, or controversial government action face unusual legal backlash. Now, a government is often labeled authoritarian when it uses law selectively to target critics rather than neutrally enforce justice, when they attempt to intimidate journalists who hold power to account, or when it signals to the public that dissent or reporting on dissent carries legal risk. Now, whether or not you agree with the label, the perception of government overreach is spreading, and that's at the core of today's culture check. Now, there's voices going all around. Some who are against the arrest are saying press freedom organizations warn that this could discourage, journalists from reporting on protests and government policies. Other journalists and civil rights groups compare it to authoritarian tactics used in places where free press is weak or absent. Now, those who are agreeing with the government say that law enforcement says Lemon was part of, or at least present for, a protest that disrupted a church service, which has its own legal protection. Now, I want to ask y'all a few things. Should journalists be neutral observers or active participants in protest? That's one thought. Another question I have, does the government have a right to prosecute if it believes laws were broken, even if it makes journalists uneasy? And another question, at what point does enforcement become intimidation? Those are three important questions that I encourage there to be discussion. I encourage debate on this. Culture check isn't just opinion, it's interrogation of norms. Now, with all this being said, to really understand this moment, we have to talk about the law the government is leaning on with Don Lemon, which is the FACE Act, and why it's used here and it has raised serious constitutional concerns. Now, you might ask, what is the FACE Act? FACE is the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrance Act, which was passed in 1994, and its original purpose was to protect access to reproductive health services, to prevent force, threats, or physical obstruction, and to safeguard houses of worship from intimidation or disruption. On paper, it's a civil rights law meant to protect people from being blocked, threatened, or interfered with while exercising lawful activity. Now, in cases like this with Don Lemon, federal agents argue that the protest interfered with access to a protected space. In this case, it was the church. They're also saying individuals present may have contributed to obstruction. And they're also saying federal jurisdiction applies even if local charges are unclear. Now, this right here is how journalists can become legally vulnerable. And if the government frames documentation as participation, presence becomes evidence. And that's the pivot point there. Now, why is this controversial? Civil liberties advocates argue that using the FACE Act in this context is a stretch beyond its original intent, a way to federalize protest-related arrest, and it's a method that collapses the line between observer and act. The FACE Act does not require physical violence, let me remind you. Interference or intimidation as interpreted by authorities can be enough to establish probable cause. And that's a wide net. Now, I want to discuss, there is a critical distinction, but it needs to be discussed, between arrest versus convictions. This matters because probable cause is all that is needed for arrest. Prosecutors do not have to prove guilt at that stage. Charges can later be reduced or dropped. But the arrest itself, it sends a message, it creates legal risk, and it discourages coverage. And this is why critics say the FACE Act, when broadly applied, can function as a tool of deterrence, not just accountability. And now journalists are really alarmed right now, because historically, broad civil rights statutes have sometimes been used not just to protect rights, but to control who is allowed to challenge power. Mind you, during the civil rights era, public order laws, interference statutes, and conspiracy claims were all used to arrest people even when convictions failed. The concern now is that the FACE Act is filling the same role, legally defensible on paper, constitutionally troubling in practice. Now, the question I'm going to ask here is the FACE Act being used to protect access or to police dissent? Because when journalists are arrested under protest laws, when reporting is reframed as obstruction, and when federal power is applied selectively, you're no longer just enforcing the law. You're shaping behavior through fear. And history shows us that authoritarianism doesn't start with banning speech. It starts with redefining it as interference. The bottom line here, y'all, is the law matters and context matters more. And when civil rights laws are used in ways that chill other civil rights, it's not unpatriotic to ask questions. It's responsible, if you ask me. Now, why does this feel so familiar? For many Americans, especially minority communities, the arrest of a journalist covering a protest doesn't just feel alarming. It brings back very familiar feelings. If some of you who are alive remember, during the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s, government authorities repeatedly used law enforcement, vague statutes, and public order laws to suppress dissent, and particularly when that dissent came from Black Americans and their allies. Examples include arresting civil rights leaders under loitering, disturbing the peace, or unlawful assembly laws, targeting journalists who documented police brutality or segregation abuses, or those who label protests as disruptions rather than constitutionally protecting speech. Let me be clear, the goal wasn't always conviction. Often it was just intimidation, disruption, and chilling participation. But during the civil rights era as well, reporters covering events like Birmingham, Selma, and Jackson were arrested, assaulted, or had their equipment seized. Authorities argued journalists were interfering rather than reporting. News coverage itself was framed as provocation. And that's critical right there, because history shows that when power feels threatened, the press becomes a target. And it's so sad to say this in 2026. But minority communities are often the first to recognize authoritarian patterns because they lived through earlier versions of them. Historically, laws were enforced selectively, not equally. The same conduct was treated differently depending on who was involved. Government power expanded first against groups already viewed as disruptive. So when a journalist covering a protest is arrested today, many people of color don't see an isolated incident, y'all. They see a recycled playbook that keeps happening again and again and again. But just like in the 1960s, the danger isn't only the arrest. It's the message, y'all. If you document dissent, you may be treated as part of it. And that message disproportionately impacts journalists covering racial justice, immigration enforcement reporting, police accountability, and faith-based protest movements, along with minority-led demonstrations. And this is how legal pressure becomes social construct without ever banning speech outright. Let me be clear, the concern isn't that laws exist. It's that they are being applied selectively. Civil rights attorneys warn that when journalists are arrested under protest-related statutes, when charges hinge on proximity, presence, or interpretation, or the government frames coverage as participation, you create a chilling effect where journalists self-censor or avoid legal risk. That's not hypothetical. That's documented history. The same legal strategy used during the civil rights movement, arrest first, justify later, and let fear do the work. Most civil rights arrests didn't lead to convictions, but they disrupted movements, intimidated witnesses, and slowed exposures. The law wasn't always wrong, but the application was. If y'all didn't understand anything I said, remember this. The danger isn't that the government can arrest a journalist. The danger is when the law becomes flexible enough to arrest any journalist the moment their reporting becomes inconvenient. And that right there is how democracy drifts, not collapse. Authoritarianism doesn't begin when courts stop working. It begins when arrests start doing the talking. Authoritarianism rarely announces itself with tanks and dictators, as y'all might think. You know where it shows up as? it shows up as just enforcing the laws, or they're just there to maintain order, or they're just doing their job. History teaches us that civil rights are rarely taken all at once. They're narrowed, tested, and selectively enforced until resistance becomes risky. And why this matters? Because during the civil rights era, many Americans said, "This is just one arrest. This doesn't affect me. The law must be respected." We now teach those moments as warnings we ignored too long. And the question I'm asking today is very simple. Are we paying attention early, or are we explaining things away again? You don't have to believe America is authoritarian to recognize authoritarian behavior. And you don't have to relive the civil rights era to remember what happens when power goes unchecked. Now, there's one more layer to this conversation that I was a little hesitant to bring up, that many Americans are quietly asking about. And it's the timing, because the arrest of a high-profile journalist didn't happen in a vacuum. It appears that it's happened as renewed attention was being placed on the Epstein files. And if y'all paid attention after all the hoorah was going around, documents tied to the Epstein files, which has the most disturbing abuse and trafficking scandals in modern American history. That was also released. Files that raised uncomfortable questions about powerful individuals, institutional failures, and who has been protected for far too long. And historically, moments like that matter. Let's be clear here. No one has to prove a secret meeting or coordinated plot to ask a legitimate question. Political distraction doesn't require conspiracy. It requires attention economics. And when the public is focused on a controversial arrest, media outrage, and political infringing, they're not focused on systemic accountability. And this is a documented phenomenon. Highly visible conflict often overshadows slow-burning revelations that threaten entrenched power. Again, this isn't new, y'all. Throughout history, including during the Civil Rights era, moments of accountability were often drowned out by law and order crackdowns, arrests that dominated headlines, and culture wars that redirected outrage. And the result was the same. The story that required long attention lost to the story that created immediate emotion. Why do moments of potential accountability so often coincide with moments of public diversion? And even if the overlap is unintentional, the effect is still the same. Because the attention shifts, pressure eases, and the powerful breathe easier. Now, why does this matter? For democracy, I would say a healthy democracy can hold more than one truth at the same time. We should be able to ask, was the arrest lawful? Was it appropriate? And why are certain stories always buried beneath spectacle? Because when distraction becomes normal, accountability becomes optional. And this just brings us to a full circle, y'all. When journalists are arrested, when dissent is reframed as interference, and when public attention is pulled away from deeper scrutiny, that's not just a media problem. That's a democratic one. Now, you don't have to believe every theory to recognize every pattern. You don't have to assume intent to question outcome. And you don't have to choose between law and liberty. Because history shows us that when both are healthy, neither fears transparency. That's why the culture check exists. To slow the moment down, to look past the spectacle, and to ask the questions power hopes we're too distracted to finish. This is why we need to stay awake, we need to stay grounded, and we need to keep our eyes on what really matters. Until next time, y'all, peace and love.